Myst, Might, Mayhem. By Han Jung-Wioya. Chapter 239. Turning Misfortune into Blessing. Part 1. Blood dripped down from Seo Yaren's left sword finger. And about 5 feet behind her stood Mok Jiangun, breathing heavily. Zhu Wenhyang's expression as she looked at the two of them was close to shock. How could this be? She had expected to see Mok Jiangun being brutally defeated by Seo Yaren's hand, but the opposite result had occurred. The peerless sword technique she unleashed had been thoroughly shattered. One could tell just by looking at the intense whirlwind of sword energy that had vanished in an instant. Of course, she wasn't the only one surprised. He dismantled the technique. Seo Yaren, the junior 4th rank, was also at a loss for words from shock. While there had been those who blocked this continuous true-chasing second revolving sword technique when she used it, no one had ever dismantled it before. After all, this chasing second revolving sword was a technique that maximized power and compensated for weaknesses through clockwise and counterclockwise rotations. Yet Mok Jiangun had shattered it. And he did so by unifying all of his sword energy into a single point. How could something like this happen? This was something even Seo Yaren herself couldn't do. Gathering sword energy into a single point was a realm that even she couldn't reach at her current level. Yet he had entered that supreme realm in an instant? Even though she saw it with her own eyes and directly experienced it, it was unbelievable. To think such talent existed in this world. It was beyond imagination. Was this the level of talent her great-grandfather, once called the pinnacle of the old martial arts world, possessed? No matter how outstanding one's martial talent was, reaching a level that surpassed one's own limits, let alone entering a realm one couldn't access, during a duel was something utterly incomprehensible. Drip. Cold sweat trickled down her cheeks. Her left hand had already lost strength due to Mok Jiangun's unified sword technique. If he unleashed this technique that transcended the realm of limitations once more, she wondered if she could even block it. No. At times like this, fighting spirit is crucial. Even he would have difficulty executing such a technique again. Since he had used a technique that far exceeded his own limits, his body must have been strained. If she targeted that point, subduing him was still well within reach. Moreover, she had yet to use her unique skill. Swoosh! Seo Yaren flicked the blood off her left sword finger and tightly clenched her right sword finger. Then, as she turned her body, she spoke. Impressive. However, I also... Thud. It was at that moment. Mok Jiangun, who had been breathing roughly, suddenly collapsed to the floor. Hazy steam rose from his fallen body. SSSSSS. Seeing this, Seo Yaren furrowed her brows, unable to hide her bewilderment. She approached the fallen Mok Jiangun. Even heat could be felt, as if his body temperature had skyrocketed. Swish! Seo Yaren placed a finger on one of Mok Jiangun's acupoints. Then, after examining the exposed parts of his body, she clicked her tongue with trembling eyes. His entire body was severely swollen with bruises, as if all his muscles had ruptured, and even the strange energy within his body was raging erratically like someone who had lost control. His body has been overused beyond the extreme. Is this the price of that single sword strike that surpassed his abilities and limits? The condition was more serious than she thought. But it wasn't incomprehensible either. After all, that single sword strike wasn't something the current Mok Jiangun should have been able to execute. Since he wielded a sword his body couldn't endure, this was probably the natural consequence. Huh. Seo Yaren let out a sigh. With this degree of internal and external injuries, participating in the embroidered uniform guard selection was impossible from the start, and continuing to participate itself seemed unreasonable. If he couldn't control his blood vessels, meridians, and internal energy here, he might lose his martial arts forever. However, all of this was something he brought upon himself. This bastard tried to kill Wenhyang and the trainee Wei Buchong. In the end, he must be punished for what he did. There was no need to go out of her way to help him. It would be better to refer him for disciplinary action in this state. Junior 4th rank. At that moment, upon hearing Zhu Wenhang's voice, Xiao Yaran turned her head. Thud. The sound of a window opening could be heard. Soon, the chilly autumn wind slapped his cheeks, causing him to regain consciousness. Zhu Wenhang slowly opened his closed eyes. It was difficult to understand what had happened. He clearly remembered talking to Xiao Yaran about what had happened with Mok Jiangyun before losing consciousness. Ugh. His stomach felt as if it had been turned inside out. Dizziness washed over him, but as he regulated his breathing, it soon subsided. Where am I? In addition to the cold air, the scent of medicinal herbs permeated the room. It seemed this place wasn't his dormitory. As he was feeling puzzled, a clear voice reached his ears. You're awake. Junior 4th rank. The owner of that voice was none other than his teacher, Xiao Yaran. Zhu Wenhang hurriedly raised his upper body from the bed. However, perhaps due to his internal injuries, he couldn't even sit up halfway. Xiao Yaran spoke to him as he struggled. Don't strain yourself. Your internal injuries were quite severe. Fortunately, I treated them with internal energy, so if you circulate your energy for about 2 days, you'll be fine. Did you heal me, Master? I'm the only one who can treat you. Zhu Wenhang let out an exclamation at her words. It was because they shared the same innate true energy that she could treat and heal his internal energy. Zhu Wenhang slowly circulated his innate true energy and examined his body. Zhu Wenhang furrowed his brows for a moment. The amount of innate true energy within his body had increased significantly compared to usual. If he gained enlightenment with this much energy, he could reach the 4-star level. Zhu Wenhang looked at her with surprised eyes. Junior 4th rank. How could this? Xiao Yaran shook her head and spoke to the astonished Zhu Wenhang. You've also mastered the innate true energy, so you know it differs from regular internal energy. Of course, he knew that. Ordinary internal energy masters couldn't control innate true energy. Only she could assist in treating his injuries. The innate true energy I injected to treat you was more than I expected. This injury has turned misfortune into a blessing for you. She spoke calmly, but Zhu Wenhang clicked his tongue inwardly. It was quite a large amount of innate true energy. Of course, for her level, it might not be considered much. Pack. Zhu Wenhang endured the pain and forcefully clasped his hands in salute. Thank you, Junior 4th rank. How can I repay this favor? Before he could finish, Xiao Yaran shook her head again. Then, with a soft sigh, she said, It's fine. More importantly, you were right. About what? As you said, it seems trainee Wei Buchong had indeed stuck a poison needle into the wooden pillow of the bed. The poison investigation unit has already confirmed it. Ah. It was Zhu Wenhang who had defended Mok Jiangyun to the best of his ability before fainting. In fact, he didn't have to defend him. Even though Mok Jiangyun had changed his mind halfway, it was true that he had tried to kill Zhu Wenhang. However, he owed a debt to Mok Jiangyun and strangely didn't want to do that. So, he had made sure Xiao Yaran cleared up the misunderstanding. Therefore, since trainee Mok Jiangyun saved your life and considering what you explained, he received a suspension of indictment as a mitigating factor. Embroidered uniform guards had arrived at the scene while he was defending Mok Jiangyun. No matter how many nearby guard warriors he had knocked unconscious by sealing their acupoints, it would have been stranger if the nearby embroidered uniform guards on duty hadn't noticed such an intense fight. Regardless of the circumstances, Mok Jiangyun, who had escalated the incident, was referred to the disciplinary department, but ultimately received a suspension of indictment. Thank you, Junior 4th rank. No need. However, even though trainee Mok Jiangyun received a suspension of indictment, he may have to voluntarily withdraw from the embroidered uniform guard selection. What? What does that mean? Could it be because of Mok Jiangyun's injuries? He had already guessed that Mok Jiangyun's body had been strained after shattering Xiao Yaran's technique and suddenly collapsing. So Zhu Wenhang asked, are his injuries severe? Yes. He drew out a power that exceeded his own abilities. She recalled the conversation she had with the embroidered uniform guard's exclusive imperial physician last night. How is it? Even though I wanted to control his internal energy, I couldn't do anything because he possessed a completely opposite energy to mine. Oh my. I don't know how to tell you this. What do you mean? As a physician, I don't practice martial arts, so it's difficult for me to speak about energy, but there are too many ruptured muscles and blood vessels throughout his body. I'm aware of that. I just want to know if he'll recover. With this extent of injuries, recovery in the near future is absolutely impossible. Then, is it possible if he takes time? It's hard to give you a definite answer. Since major muscles are torn and ruptured in many places, even if he recovers, he may have difficulty moving as he did before. It was an unfortunate situation, but it was serious. The circulation of his internal energy was also a mess, and it wasn't just regular internal energy but an energy completely opposite to innate true energy, so she couldn't treat it as she had done for Ju Wenhyang. With a body like this, continuing the embroidered uniform guard selection process was unreasonable. She might have to advise him to voluntarily withdraw as soon as he woke up. Late the next night. There are various ranks within the Imperial Hospital. Among them, the lowest rank, the 9th grade Shambong, had to be on standby at all times to check on patients' conditions, even if not in the dispensary. Cho Chambong, a 9th grade physician of the Embroidered Uniform Guard's internal hospital, clicked his tongue while looking at a patient with needles stuck all over his body. His entire body was covered in bruises, and it was the first time he had seen a patient like this. You won't have many opportunities to examine a patient in such a critically severe condition. So, observe and record in detail. Yes, Supervisor. Upon receiving orders from the Embroidered Uniform Guard's junior 4th rank, his senior, the 7th grade physician Supervisor J, who was diagnosing and treating the patient, gave him the opportunity to examine the patient as well. Supervisor J had already judged that this patient's complete recovery was virtually impossible. In fact, he had felt the same when he personally checked the patient's pulse and examined the affected areas. With this degree of damage to the muscles and blood vessels, the patient might not be able to move properly for a long time, or even walk properly for the rest of his life. TSK. What in the world did he do to end up like this? It was utterly incomprehensible. With such thoughts, Cho Chambong sat next to the patient with a decoction in hand. He slowly dipped a cloth into the medicine and placed it inside the patient's mouth. For unconscious patients, the tongue is brought into contact with the soaked cloth to allow them to absorb even a small amount of the medicinal energy. Swish! Cho Chambong, who had placed the cloth on the patient's tongue, checked his pulse. Then, one of his eyebrows trembled and rose. What's this? Something was strange. Just last night, the patient's pulse was extremely irregular and weak. But now, the pulse was steady. Finding this odd, Cho Chambong checked not only the pulse on the wrist but also the major acupoints, including the neck. Doing so, he stood up with a surprised expression. What's going on? How could this happen overnight? Thinking that he should report this to his senior who was in the dormitory, Cho Chambong entrusted the task of administering the medicine to a dispensary worker and hurriedly left. Not long after he left, the door opened, and someone entered. As the person entered, the dispensary worker who was holding the medicinal cloth to the patient's mouth was startled and stood up to greet him. What brings you here so late at night, Your Excellency? An old eunuch in a red official robe with face powder. He was none other than Eunuch Biam of the Western Depot. Eunuch Biam approached the dispensary worker and asked, I came to check on the patient's condition. The dispensary worker couldn't help but feel inwardly puzzled by these words. That was because he knew this patient was a guard trainee participating in the embroidered uniform guard selection. Why would a eunuch from the Western Depot come to see such a person? Although puzzled, the dispensary worker stepped aside and said, the patient's condition is not very good, so it will take several more days for him to wake up. Is it that serious? That's what the attending physician, Supervisor Bay, said. Ah. Is that so? It seems quite severe. From what I heard, even if he's lucky enough to wake up, he won't be able to move for a while, and he may not be able to walk properly for the rest of his life. Upon hearing the dispensary worker's words, the corners of Eunuch BM's mouth slightly curled up. The dispensary worker's suspicion grew even more at that sight. The patient's condition is said to be poor, but why does he seem pleased? Finding it strange, Eunuch BM said, "Could you give me a moment alone? But the medicine needs to be administered now, it won't take long." With those words, Eunuch BM took out a bundle of silver coins from his bosom. The dispensary worker gulped at the sight of this. Then, he quietly accepted the bundle of silver coins, bowed his head, and left the room. Once alone, Eunuch BM approached the patient who had needles stuck all over his body and his eyes closed. Ho ho ho. Eunuch BM laughed, unable to contain his joy. He had never expected things to go so smoothly. Just until yesterday, he had been sweating profusely, pleading for reconsideration, saying that this fellow had endangered His Majesty and himself because that person had shown interest in him. However, that person's judgment was different. Even if he was someone who had endangered His Majesty and himself, if he was such an outstanding talent, that person wanted to bring him under his wing somehow. He even gave orders to meet with the fellow and arrange a position for him. For Eunuch BM, it was an order that couldn't have been more troublesome. But the heavens helped him. It was Mok Jaeong-un, wasn't it? Eunuch BM looked down at Mok Jaeong-un and grinned. He had thought that a monstrous fellow like him would rarely be defeated by anyone, but how coincidental was this? It was an opportunity given by the heavens. For the sake of His Majesty, himself, and that person, a guy like this must never be allowed to come close. So, with certainty, "I'll shatter your dungeon, you bastard." If that happened, even the slightest possibility of him rising from the dead would completely vanish. With that in mind, Eunuch BM brought his hand toward Mok Jaeong-un's abdomen. Just as his palm was about to touch the skin below the navel, "What are you doing?" In an instant, Eunuch BM's body froze as he was about to place his palm. What the fuck was that just now? Did he mishear? He was clearly told that the patient's injuries were severe and he wouldn't wake up for several days. But what the hell was going on? Could it be? Eunuch BM's eyes slowly moved from the abdomen up the chest, neck, and then to the face. Thump. At that moment, his heart sank. That's because Mok Jaeong-un, who had been lying as if dead with his eyes closed, had suddenly opened his eyes wide and was staring at him. Chapter 240. Turning Misfortune into Blessing. Part 2. Eunuch BM, the eunuch from the Western Depot, couldn't hide his bewilderment. He had been reassured after hearing from Supervisor J, the physician in charge of the embroidered uniform guard, that Mok Jaeong-un's injuries were so severe that he wouldn't wake up for several days. However, Mok Jaeong-un, who had been lying as if dead with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes and stared at him, causing Eunuch BM to be startled. What's going on? He wasn't sure what had happened, but it seemed Mok Jaeong-un had woken up earlier than the physician's prediction. Eunuch BM, whose heart had nearly leaped out of his chest from shock, quickly composed himself. Although he had been surprised by Mok Jaeong-un's opened eyes, Mok Jaeong-un was still an injured man. Wasn't it said that his condition was so dire that he might never walk properly again? They say you get scared by the ladle after being frightened by the snake. It seemed the defeat he had suffered there had greatly affected him. There was no need for him to be intimidated in this situation, but he had unconsciously shrunk back. Chuck. Eunuch BM, who had hesitated, hurriedly placed his hand above Mok Jaeong-un's dungeon. Mok Jaeong-un, who had been staring at him, raised an eyebrow and spoke. "What are you trying to do? Your name is Mok Jaeong-un, isn't it? So what? Huh. Your imposing manner is still impressive. To not even blink an eye in this situation, he has a grand presence indeed." In a state where he couldn't move due to his injuries, Eunuch BM had his hand placed above Mok Jaeong-un's dungeon. This meant that with just a little force, he could shatter Mok Jaeong-un's dungeon. Yet, Mok Jaeyoung showed no sign of dismay. Rather, he was incredibly calm. Quack. Eunuch BM pressed his fingers into the area around Mok Jaeyoung's danjian, applying force. Then, he spoke. This may be misfortune for you, but the heavens are on your side. Accept the consequences of insulting His Majesty and shattering this old man's shoulder without resentment. His Majesty? Seeing Mok Jaeyoung's puzzled expression, Eunuch BM scoffed and said, Didn't this old man clearly warn you not to provoke that noble person? That noble identity you spoke of was His Majesty? Don't carelessly utter his name. A ruffian from the martial arts world like you has no right to speak of him so casually. Eunuch BM scolded him sternly. In response, Mok Jaeyoung chuckled and said, The title, His Majesty, must be quite revered, seeing as you tell me not to even mention it. Insolent fellow. This guy's arrogance was astounding. However, his sarcastic attitude in this situation was truly irritating. Eunuch BM gathered his internal energy and formed a sharp chi on his fingertips, stabbing it into Mok Jaeyoung's abdomen. Pfft. About one knuckle of his finger penetrated the abdomen. Eunuch BM curved the corners of his mouth mockingly. Now, even this guy should realize that he was in a position where he had to beg and plead. Eunuch BM furrowed his brows. Even though 5 of his fingers had penetrated about 1 knuckle deep into the abdomen, Mok Jaeyoung was staring at him without any change in expression. He seemed to possess an incredibly strong endurance. At this point, he should have been groveling pathetically. However, Mok Jaeyoung opened his mouth. It's a bit different from what I expected. I don't think the person above your master would have ordered you to kill me. This bastard? Eunuch BM's eyes flickered with surprise. How did this guy guess the intentions of that person? As he wondered, Mok Jaeyoung tilted his head slightly and continued. If they had sent an even stronger eunuch to test me, it doesn't seem like they would have done that. But since you're acting this way, is it because I'm injured and the person above you has changed their mind? Or are you defying their orders and seeking revenge on me, not wanting to miss the opportunity while I'm injured? Eunuch BM was momentarily dumbfounded. Who the hell was this guy? He was reading the situation based on fragmented circumstances without even knowing who that person was. Due to the incident at the inn amidst the heavy rain, Eunuch BM had already considered Mok Jaeyoung to have an exceptionally sharp mind, bordering on being vicious, but this left him tongue-tied. This guy's true value wasn't limited to his martial arts. His intelligence was also outstanding. That made him even more fearsome. My judgment is indeed correct. This guy must never be allowed near His Highness. Although Eunuch BM had wanted to see Mok Jaeyoung looking fearful or pathetic, now he only thought of quickly shattering his danjian. As he tried to apply force to his fingers. Tremble. Suddenly, as if blocked by something, his fingers couldn't penetrate the flesh. Moreover, the internal energy that had been in his fingers gradually dissipated. What in the world? At that moment of bewilderment, his fingers, which had penetrated with a strong repulsive force from inside the body, were expelled outward. What? What was going on here? Both the physician and the embroidered uniform guard supervising the martial arts had said that Mok Jaeyoung's internal injuries were so severe that he would have difficulty controlling his own body. With ruptured blood vessels, muscles, and disrupted internal energy circulation, he should have been no different from a cripple. Yet, how could he exert this level of power? Eunuch BM, who had been momentarily astonished, tried to strike Mok Jaeyoung's abdomen again. I must destroy his danjian. Regardless of what had happened, if he destroyed the danjian, everything would be over. Just as Eunuch BM's palm was about to crash down on Mok Jaeyoung's danjian, with enough force to shatter not only the danjian but also the internal organs, an unexpected event occurred. It was Pack. The needles inserted all over Mok Jaeyoung's body were ejected outward. If they had simply been pulled out, it would have been fine, but each needle was imbued with internal energy, scattering in all directions like hidden weapons. PFFT. Hook. Eunuch BM hurriedly waved his hands, trying to block them, but 7 needles pierced through his body. Although they were thin needles, 3 penetrated his abdomen, 1 his shoulder, 1 above his right clavicle, and the others pierced through his left palm and right thigh. Coo. The pain was so excruciating that Eunuch BM collapsed backward. Particularly, the areas where the needles had penetrated his abdomen and above his clavicle were in a dire state. They were all vital acupuncture points. Eunuch BM hastily circulated his internal energy, trying to block the punctured areas. However, the internal energy is dissipating. Centered around the punctured areas, his internal energy was scattering. In a panic, Eunuch BM drew upon more internal energy and circulated it. If the internal energy was dissipating, the only way to overcome it was with stronger internal energy. Right at that moment. Shook. Eunuch BM's eyes widened. He saw Mok Jaehyun sitting up from the bed. But that wasn't all. Black steam began to emanate from his entire body, and the bruised skin gradually lightened in color. Could it be that he's healing? No matter how he looked at it, that seemed to be the only explanation. His speculation was correct. As Mok Jaehyun sat up and circulated the rampaging energy within his body, it stabilized, and the bruised skin rapidly restored itself. In fact, Mok Jaehyun's body had undergone a miraculous self-recovery overnight, and the remaining external wounds were healing. A small gasp escaped Mok Jaehyun's mouth. This was because, as he circulated and soothed the rampaging energy within his body, he noticed that the amount of energy had significantly increased compared to before. Especially the demonic energy, which had increased by more than 40%. What's this? Even Mok Jaehyun himself had been aware when he collapsed. The technique of concentrating sword energy into one had surpassed the limits of his body and enlightenment. As a result, his overexerted body couldn't endure it and had broken down. This was the first time such a thing had happened since he began cultivating martial arts. "Are you all right, mortal?" Chong Ryong, who had been waiting for Mok Jaehyun to wake up, asked with a worried voice. She, too, had been concerned that something might have gone wrong due to Mok Jaehyun exerting a force beyond his limits and the physician's words. If it had been possible to possess Mok Jaehyun, she would have wanted to temporarily take over his body and heal him. However, since possession was impossible for Mok Jaehyun, she could only watch. "Yes. I feel much better now. How did you manage to exert such power?" "That power. The one where you unified the sword energy into one." Even she had been astonished upon witnessing Mok Jaehyun's technique. It was a realm that even she, who still had lingering attachments to the sword even after death, couldn't imagine, let alone reach. Yet, she wondered how this fellow had momentarily approached a domain close to the pinnacle of swordsmanship. "I'm not sure. Nothing else comes to mind." "You didn't think of anything else?" Upon hearing these words, Chong Ryong genuinely admired Mok Jaehyun. In that fleeting moment, transcending any realm, he had considered that to be the only optimal move. Mok Jaehyun had simply realized it. It was just that his enlightenment and body hadn't fully supported him, so he had borne the full brunt of the backlash. Chong Ryong, who had been clicking her tongue, finally spoke. "You bastard, you really are a born martial arts genius." Mok Jaehyun's eyes flickered with surprise at her words. This was because she, who usually refrained from speaking even in ordinary situations, had given him a proper compliment for the first time. It seemed she acknowledged him to that extent. But don't overexert yourself. Even if you momentarily approached such a realm through a heaven-defying enlightenment, you have now experienced firsthand the consequences of doing so when unprepared. Well, that's true. But what? Mok Jaehyun silently clenched his fist tightly. The intensity of the force exerted by his hand. It had become much stronger than before he collapsed. It was as if the swollen and torn muscles had become even more robust to endure it. This wasn't a mere feeling. The blood vessels are the same. The speed at which energy circulated had greatly increased. Just like when he had surpassed the bottleneck, it had now become as natural as breathing. Because of this, Mok Jaeyoung himself felt a strange sensation. How curious. Would others also experience such a rapid change in their bodies when surpassing their limits? It didn't seem so. According to the medical knowledge he had learned from his grandfather and various medical texts, the human body was designed to slowly adapt to limits or harsh situations, not undergo such drastic changes. In that regard, he seemed to be distinctly different from ordinary people. At that moment, Mok Jaeyoung turned his head. There, he saw eunuch Byum from the Western Depot, lying on the floor, dragging his body and trying to quietly escape while suppressing his presence. Mok Jaeyoung chuckled and got off the bed. Damn it! Startled, eunuch Byum hurriedly struck the floor with both hands. Pack! Using the rebound force, he tried to stand up. However, thwack! Ugh! As he got up, Mok Jaeyoung kicked him, causing him to fall back down. Mok Jaeyoung pressed his foot on the area between eunuch Byum's neck and chest. Quack! Cuckoo! Pressing down on that area, it was impossible for eunuch Byum to breathe properly. To the suffocating eunuch Byum, Mok Jaeyoung said, "It seems you don't have much attachment to life." Coo. What? Just like last time, even though I was minding my own business, you deliberately provoked me. Flinch. At Mok Jaeyoung's words, eunuch Byum's face turned red and then ashen. Struggling to breathe, he hastily said, "Cuckoo. If you try to harm me here, His Highness Prince Jaeongjin will never." Ah. So it was him? The corners of Mok Jaeyoung's mouth twitched. Seeing that expression, eunuch Byum's eyes wavered. What was this? It was different from the reaction he had expected. Prince Jaeongjin was the younger brother of His Majesty the Emperor and one of the 4 true powers of this nation. With this cunning fellow, he should have understood what he meant, so why was he making such an ominous expression? Right at that moment. Crack! Crunch! The sound of a clavicle breaking rang out. Eunuch Byum couldn't hold back the scream of pain. Mok Jaeyoung kicked his chin. Thwack! Crunch! Coo! The sound of teeth colliding and shattering echoed. Mok Jaeyoung bent down and brought his face close to the suffering eunuch Byum. Does it hurt a lot? Coo! As he opened his mouth, all of his teeth were cracked, and broken pieces fell out with a clatter. Of course, they fell into his mouth, causing him to choke and sputter. Mok Jaeyoung grabbed the face of eunuch Byum, who was coughing up blood, and examined it closely. Then, he smiled brightly and said, "Fortunately, the skin on your face is intact." Upon hearing those words, the suffering eunuch Byum furrowed his brows. What the hell was he talking about? After making his jaw and teeth like this, was he now saying that his face was fine? Damn bastard. You have made a grave mistake. In the end, by making him like this, he had gained justification to persuade His Highness. A dog that couldn't be leashed shouldn't be kept. Prepare yourself. Anyway, since there was also the crime of attempting to assassinate His Majesty, using this as justification, he would definitely. Pfft. At that moment, eunuch Byum's eyes widened. He felt a sharp blade penetrating his jaw and reaching inside his nose. The pain rushed in all at once, causing him to twist his body in a struggle. But then... Ta-ta-ta-ta-tack. At that moment, Mok Jaeyoung sealed his acupoints, rendering him unable to move. Of course, he also sealed the points that would stop him from making any sound. In agony yet unable to speak, eunuch Byum could only open his eyes wide as Mok Jaeyoung whispered softly in his ear. "It's a pity you didn't just die back then. If you did, none of this would have happened." Screech! With those words, Mok Jaeyoung carefully moved the blade up and down, as if he was delicately peeling off the skin. What are you doing? Eunuch Byum's eyes widened even further, his pupils shaking madly. Regardless, Mok Jaeyoung continued his work with an elated smile. Screech! Screech! Stop! Stop it! With his eyes wide open, Eunuch BM watched as his facial skin was slowly peeled away, his pupils gradually losing focus. Chapter 241. Turning Misfortune into Blessing. Part 3. Two government officials were hurriedly heading to the embroidered uniform guard hospital. They were Supervisor J, a 7th grade physician, and Cho Chambong, a 9th grade physician. With drowsy eyes, Supervisor J spoke in an irritated voice. "If what you say isn't true, you'd better be prepared for the consequences." "It's the truth. I even checked the 8 major pulses." "Oh my. You." Supervisor J shook his head. "That's because the guard trainee named Mok Jiangun, who was hospitalized, was in no condition to wake up or improve in a short period of time. Yet, how could his pulse return to normal overnight? After assigning night duty, it seemed like the physician had left his senses somewhere out of fatigue." "Nonsense." He was determined to give him a good scolding. As they approached the hospital, they saw someone squatting outside, dozing off. It was the dispensary worker. "Hey, you rascal." Cho Chambong reprimanded him upon seeing him. The dispensary worker was startled and jumped up from his spot like a disciplined soldier. Then, noticing Supervisor J and Cho Chambong, he spoke in a flustered manner. My lords. I told you to take care of my patient, yet you're slacking off." That's not it." "What do you mean that's not it?" "Right now, a guest has come inside at the moment." "A guest?" Out of the blue, who was this guest? As they were wondering, the dispensary worker carefully said, "It's the junior supervisor eunuch of the Western Depot." "Junior supervisor eunuch?" At those words, Supervisor J and Cho Chambong looked at each other, unable to hide their bewilderment. Among the eunuchs of the Western Depot, the position of junior supervisor eunuch was high enough to directly attend to the imperial family. But why had a junior supervisor eunuch come to the embroidered uniform guard hospital? Thinking something was amiss, they hurriedly went inside. Upon entering, Cho Chambong, who was leading the way, looked around. Then, seeing a bed, he couldn't hide his perplexity. Gasp! Seeing him so shocked that he almost fell backward, Supervisor J and the dispensary worker also looked in that direction. However, eek! What is this? The reason for their shock was simple. On the bed where the patient should have been lying, something torn into dozens of pieces was placed. As physicians, they could immediately sense what it was. It was none other than a dismembered corpse. Faced with such a horrific sight, they were utterly perplexed about what to do. As they stood there, shocked and at a loss, a rustling sound came from somewhere. They simultaneously turned their heads. It was in front of the medicinal herb drawers where various medicinal ingredients were stored, and someone wearing a red official robe could be seen. My lord?" The dispensary worker unknowingly called out to him. Then, the person in the red official robe turned his head and grinned eerily in the flickering lantern light. ******. By Jiang Palace. This was the palace where Prince Jiangjin, one of the 4 most powerful figures in the country, resided. Originally, Prince Jiangjin was governing the Sichuan region as a royal relative, but when the current emperor, who had cherished him even before his enthronement, ascended to the throne, he was summoned to the capital, Kaifeng. And a palace was given to him to stay in. Although the emperor cherished his younger brother, he added the character Bai, meaning to be cautious and diligent, to the name of the palace to remind him not to forget his proper place. Of course, despite the emperor's consideration, Prince Jiangjin had steadily expanded his influence, leading to his current position. Swish! A middle-aged man in his mid-50s, exuding elegance, turned the page of an old book. A middle-aged eunuch in a red official robe quietly observed him from near the door. Just by looking at his splendid official attire, one could guess his position. The middle-aged eunuch was none other than the chief eunuch of the Western Depot. Swish! The middle-aged man, who had been turning the pages at a steady pace, finally spoke. "Eunuch BM is late." At his words, the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, spoke in a groveling voice. "Your Highness, shall I send someone to fetch him?" The identity of the elegant middle-aged man with an impressive mustache was none other than Prince Gyeongjin, the master of this Byejeon palace. As one of the four most powerful figures who controlled the country, he exuded not only elegance but also an arrogant and extraordinary spirit that seemed to encompass all things. "No, it's fine. When the time comes, he will come on his own." "Understood, Your Highness." At Prince Gyeongjin's words, the chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, bowed his head with his hands clasped together. However, concern was evident in his eyes as he bowed. "He won't disobey Your Highness's order, will he?" He had already seen Eunuch Beam unable to hide his joy upon hearing the news that Mok Jae-eun, the late-stage disciple sent by the Heaven and Earth Society, had suffered severe injuries. That worried him quite a bit. He must have been very scared. He could fully understand such feelings. According to the reports, it was natural for anyone to rejoice and not miss this opportunity after suffering such injuries and humiliation. However, this was not an opportunity for him. Examine that person's condition. We cannot lose such a valuable talent. Prince Gyeongjin wanted to have that late-stage disciple from the Heaven and Earth Society. Being someone with a strong desire for talented individuals, he didn't care at all that Mok Jae-eun had threatened the princess he cherished. On the contrary, he said that someone like him was all the more worth taming. This might be the difference between those with the ambition to rule the world and ordinary people. Eunuch Beam, please refrain from doing anything foolish. If he took this as an opportunity to do something foolish, His Highness would not forgive him. His Highness disliked those who disobeyed his orders more than anyone else. At that moment, Prince Gyeongjin closed the book he was reading and spoke. "By the way, how is that wench still unharmed?" "If you're referring to that wench." "I'm talking about that wench from Auspicious Palace." "Ah. You mean Consort Ho, Your Highness." Consort Ho. The emperor had numerous women. Among them, there were two women who received his particular favor, Imperial Noble Consort Seo and Consort Ho. Originally, the emperor favored Imperial Noble Consort Seo the most, but he also didn't hesitate to show affection to Consort Nam and Consort Seomun, who bore his children. Consort Seomun had a deep connection to Prince Gyeongjin's maternal side, his mother's family. Therefore, Prince Gyeongjin had spared no investment and effort to ensure that Consort Seomun could receive the emperor's favor. However, at some point, the dynamics within the inner court had changed. It was because of the sudden appearance of Consort Ho. A peerless beauty that one couldn't help but be captivated by. This was what everyone who saw Consort Ho said in unison. The appearance of the palace maid who had just entered the palace was so outstanding that rumors spread, saying her beauty rivaled that of Imperial Noble Consort Seo, who was called the epitome of beauty. Naturally, the story reached the ears of the lascivious emperor. A mere 3 years. It hadn't been long since she entered the palace. A young wench from a palace-maid background, without any backing, had enchanted the emperor with her appearance alone and reached the position of consort in just 3 years. Even Consort Seomun, who had given birth to a son, couldn't become a consort. A dangerous wench. At least Imperial Noble Consort Seo had won the emperor's heart over a long period of time. But this woman had achieved it in just 3 years. Prince Gyeongjin couldn't understand it. Although the emperor was lascivious and couldn't resist any woman, his conquests were also quite severe, and he would quickly lose interest. Even with his beloved Imperial Noble Consort Seo, he never stayed with her for more than 3 days. However, he stayed in Consort Ho's quarters for as long as half a month, showing an immense favor towards her. What kind of sorcery is she using? Because of this, Prince Gyeongjin and the other powerful figures also considered her dangerous. Even when they tried to bring her under their control, strangely, everyone failed. Prince Gyeongjin had also tried to do so but to no avail. He even tried to meet her in person and turn her to his side, but he ended up hearing humiliating words from her instead. "If you're a royal relative, why don't you live in accordance with your proper place and prostrate yourself flat?" Upon hearing these words, Prince Gyeongjin was greatly enraged. No matter how much she was a consort favored by the emperor, she couldn't dare say such things to him so recklessly. In the end, Prince Gyeongjin decided to use an extreme measure. It was to use a slow-acting poison to make consort Ho slowly die. Unlike other concubines, she had no backing or people to help her, so even if her body weakened, there would be no one suitable for her to turn to for help. So, Prince Gyeongjin intended to subjugate her when she was weakened. However, 2 months have passed, yet why is there no effect at all? At Prince Gyeongjin's question, the chief eunuch Ho answered with a troubled expression. "I apologize, Your Highness." In fact, Eunuch Ho was also puzzled by this. That's because he was told that the effects would appear in a month, but even after that period had passed, consort Ho remained perfectly fine. So, he had instructed the palace maid who had been planted to increase the dose of the slow-acting poison. Nevertheless, 2 months had passed, but consort Ho showed no signs of weakness. On the contrary, there was even an illusion that her complexion was getting better by the day. "Isn't there a stronger poison?" "I apologize, Your Highness, but according to the person who manufactured the poison, if the dose is increased further, it may be detected by the food taster palace maids or the supervisor of the imperial hospital." At Eunuch Ho's words, Prince Gyeongjin let out a soft sigh. With imperial noble consort Co alone being a handful, if consort Ho were to give birth to a son on top of that, the political situation could become even more chaotic. Should I focus on preventing her from conceiving instead? However, this was something the other 3 powerful figures would take action on even if he didn't. From their perspective, it was also an undesirable situation. Just as his thoughts were becoming complicated, a eunuch's voice was heard from outside. "Your Highness, Eunuch Biam requests an audience." "He's finally here. Let him in." "Yes, Your Highness." The door opened, and Eunuch Biam, who had his head bowed and hands clasped together, entered. He bowed and greeted Prince Gyeongjin. The chief eunuch of the Western Depot, Eunuch Ho, who was watching him, had a glint in his eyes. That's because, unlike the usual Eunuch Biam, he seemed calm. Even his energy was well concealed, making it difficult to sense. Eunuch Ho's eyes narrowed. No matter how much Eunuch Biam had reached the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm, Eunuch Ho was a peerless master counted among the top 4 in the palace. He shouldn't be able to completely hide his energy from me. As he was finding it strange, Prince Gyeongjin gestured for Eunuch Biam to come closer and spoke. "So, how is that person's condition? Is he likely to recover?" Step. At this question, Eunuch Biam, with his head bowed, tried to take a step forward. At that moment, Eunuch Ho quickly blocked his way with a swift lightfoot technique. "Stop right there." Prince Gyeongjin frowned and asked. "Eunuch Ho, what are you doing?" "Your Highness, please allow me to examine Eunuch Biam for a moment." "Examine him? What do you mean?" "Eunuch Biam, raise your head." Eunuch Ho told Eunuch Biam, who had his head bowed, to lift his head. Eunuch Biam slowly lowered his hands and raised his face. Eunuch Biam's face, with the characteristic powdered makeup of eunuchs, looked no different from usual. However, if there was one thing different, these eyes? Eunuch Biam, who was always cautious in everything when standing before His Highness Prince Gyeongjin and the head of the Western Depot, had a face and eyes that were utterly calm. Eunuch Ho's eyes sharpened as he grasped the handle of the leather belt at his waist and drew it out. Shing! As he pulled the leather belt, a soft sword hidden inside was revealed. Pointing the tip of the soft sword at Eunuch Biam, Eunuch Ho spoke in a voice filled with vigilance. "Who are you, you bastard?" Eunuch Biam remained silent at his question. Prince Gyeongjin, who had also sensed something suspicious, stood up from his seat and grabbed the sheath he had hung on the decorative stand behind him. What on earth was going on? Just then, Eunuch Biam's lips twitched, and he opened his mouth. Ah, this is why quick-witted people are troublesome. This was not Eunuch Biam's voice. His voice was hoarse, mixed with the characteristic gruffness of an old eunuch. But this voice was very young,